Story: Marigolds of Hope. In a small, dusty town during the heart of the Great Depression, there lived a young girl named Lizabeth. She resided in a ramshackle house on the outskirts of the town, where the streets were filled with despair and the air hung heavy with hardship. Times were tough, and the future seemed bleak to Lizabeth. Each day she witnessed her parents struggle to make ends meet. They worked tirelessly, but there was never enough food on the table, and laughter had long left their home. Anger and frustration festered within Lizabeth, and she desperately searched for an outlet for her pain. One scorching summer afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly, Lizabeth noticed a beacon of beauty amid the ugliness of her neighborhood. Mrs. Flowers, a kind and elderly woman who lived next door, tended a garden filled with vibrant marigold flowers. Their golden petals seemed to shimmer with hope in a world that had lost its luster. But Lizabeth couldn't bear to see beauty in a place where it felt so out of reach. She felt a surge of anger, and without thinking, she stormed into Mrs. Flowers' garden. In a fit of frustration, she began tearing the marigolds from their roots, crushing them underfoot. The bright flowers wilted in her grasp, their fragrance filling the air even as they withered. Mrs. Flowers, who had been watching quietly from her porch, approached Lizabeth. Her gentle voice quivered with disappointment as she said, "Child, why have you destroyed something so precious?" Lizabeth, tears streaming down her face, couldn't find words to explain her actions. She felt a deep sense of shame and guilt as she looked at the ruined marigolds. Over the following days, Lizabeth couldn't escape the weight of her actions. She watched as Mrs. Flowers painstakingly tried to salvage what was left of her garden, replanting the marigolds and nurturing them back to life. It was a stark contrast to the harshness of their world. As Lizabeth observed Mrs. Flowers' determination and resilience, a change began to stir within her. She realized that those marigolds, against all odds, represented hope. In the midst of poverty and despair, they bloomed as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for beauty and resilience. One day, as the marigolds began to regain their former glory, Lizabeth approached Mrs. Flowers. With a trembling voice, she confessed her anger and explained the frustrations that had driven her to destroy the flowers. Mrs. Flowers listened compassionately, offering forgiveness and understanding. In that moment, Lizabeth understood that beauty and hope were precious, even in the harshest of circumstances. She began to see that her anger and frustration couldn't change their situation, but they could rob her of the beauty that still existed in the world. Lizabeth dedicated herself to helping Mrs. Flowers tend to the marigolds, nurturing not only the garden, but also her own spirit. As the seasons changed, so did Lizabeth's perspective. She found solace and strength in the resilient marigolds, and as she cared for them, she learned to cultivate her own hope and beauty amid adversity. In the end, Lizabeth discovered that even in the darkest times, there was room for the marigolds of hope to bloom, bringing a sense of brightness and purpose to her life. And as she looked at those golden flowers, she realized that she, too, could be a beacon of hope in a world desperately in need of it. Moral of the story. The story of marigolds imparts a profound lesson, especially valuable for children. Even in the harshest of times, when life may seem bleak and circumstances beyond our control, there exists the potential for hope and beauty. The marigolds in Mrs. Flowers' garden represent the enduring spirit of resilience and the power of preserving beauty in our lives. Lizabeth's act of destroying them serves as a poignant reminder that anger and frustration, while understandable in challenging times, can rob us of the hope and light that still exists around us. Ultimately, the story teaches us that, like the marigolds, we can choose to nurture hope, cultivate beauty, and find strength within ourselves to face adversity with grace and courage. The end.